Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off.
Blast off on another episode of Hero Paranormal Podcast, broadcasting from the base at La Madre Mountain just south of Area 51. My name is Ryan, the original overseer of the airwaves, bringing you an epic episode today. Today on the podcast, we have Charles Lear. If you don't know who Charles Lear is, get ready. He has a new book called The Flying Saucer Investigators. The Flying Saucer Investigators is a book of history. It's about the people involved in the mystery of the flying saucers, mostly the investigators, but also the witnesses, some of whom were profoundly affected. The period covered is what has been called the Golden Age of Flying Saucers, which begins in 1947, of course, after the sighting that year by businessman pilot Kenneth Arnold, and ends in 1969 with the termination of the U.S. Air Force's investigation, which existed for most of its duration, known as Project Blue Book. The investigators ranged from kids with saucer clubs to serious-minded individuals with connections in government. There were military personnel assigned to take flying saucer reports and follow up on them, and the U.S. Congress was moved to hear arguments for a federally funded study of flying saucers on 2 occasions. The history of this golden age is presented using newsletters, magazines, case files, official documents, newspaper articles, film footage, and archived recordings from television and radio. Some of the cases the investigators looked into are presented using nothing but the facts, as they were recorded, without speculation or sensationalism, and even the die-hard skeptic may be left wondering by many of them. Charles Lear, welcome to the Hero Paranormal Podcast.
Well, thank you, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be here.
We've had quite the quandary trying to connect. I've wanted to talk to you for quite some time about your new book, The Flying Saucer Investigators. And without going into detail, you've been super, super easy to deal with because it's just been one nightmare after the other trying to connect. But we're finally connected, so this is a good thing. What took you down this path to write this book and to set it in the golden age of flying saucers, as you mentioned in the book?
Okay, well, I've been writing a blog for Martin Willis over at Podcast UFO for about 4 years. And Martin suggested, he says, I do it once a week, so that's a lot of material. And Martin suggested I put together a book, maybe a compilation of the blogs or something. And I actually got it in my idea to, along the way, I'd been exploring the actual flying saucer investigators. And my favorite period is really the 50s and the 60s. And another thing that really got me interested in certain characters was John Keel's book, The Mothman Prophecies. He talks about these guys that sounded really interesting, like Gray Barker, Jim Moseley, Ivan T. Sanderson. And, when I remember reading them, the book years back, I wonder who these guys are. They sound really interesting, especially Gray Barker and Jim Moseley, who seem to have a lot of fun at John Keel's expense. And so I got the idea to write about the investigators, and it occurred to me a perfect period would be 1947 and 1969, which is pretty much Kenneth Arnold's first sighting on June 24th, 1947, up until the termination of Project Blue Book. I date that from the press release, December 17th, 1969. So Martin had Calvin Parker, one of the other guy, one of the guys from the Pascagoula, Mississippi incident, had a blogger of Martin's had written an article about the Pascagoula incident, and this guy wrote him, "Hey, that was a really good article. Thank you very much, Calvin." And Martin says, "Is this Calvin Parker?" And he said, "Well, yes, sir, it is." So Martin got in touch with Calvin Parker, and then he got Calvin Parker in touch with Philip Mantle, and Calvin was convinced to write a book. And this story is interesting enough. Calvin said, "Okay, here's the deal. I'm sorry, Philip Mantle has a publishing company called Flying Disc Press." So Calvin said, "Yeah, okay, I'll let you. I'll write the book and let you publish it. But here's the rule: you're not allowed to edit a single word of it." And Philip agreed to it. And Calvin locked himself in a room for 2 weeks and banged out this huge book. And the book did really well. So Philip Mantle was very grateful to Martin for hooking him up. And so Martin introduced me to Philip Mantle. I pitched the idea of writing this book to Philip, and Philip went for it. So it was off to the races.
That is so neat. And I love Calvin Parker. He is a past guest, and talk about a guy that it's impossible not to believe him. It is one of those cases that I talk to a lot of people, and I don't know if I'm the perfect example of somebody who can tell when somebody's kind of spinning a yarn, but Calvin is so real, and his experiences are so real. And there was a lot going on back then. It really is the golden age or golden era of flying saucers. And you mentioned that this all starts in 1947 with Kenneth Arnold, who reported seeing, I believe, 9 objects moving at high speeds over Washington's Mount Rainier. Now, when this was widely publicized, how did people take it? Was this kind of far-fetched for people, the variety that your average American?
I'm sorry, Kenneth Arnold sighting?
Yeah, the Mount Rainier. It seems.
Yeah, initially it was, thought that maybe he saw something military. Nobody had any idea. He thought it might have been military. So the idea that this was anything, strange or unusual or something from outer space really it didn't come up until a little later, and was just sort of kind of an afterthought. And then, it wasn't, eventually, Arnold complained that people were coming up to him. "Aren't you the guy who saw the men from space, the men from Mars?" And so, but initially, he just saw something strange. But, once it was also the perfect time of year. Summer is always slow for the newspapers. So they call it the silly season. So flying saucer reports are good filler. So they printed just about everything. I mean, a guy found a priest came forward with a saw blade and said that this thing flew through the air and hit his chapel. It was like an obvious saw blade, and yet this made the paper. And they called everything discs, even if you had a 6-pointed radar target covered in aluminum foil, they still called it a disc. So, the newspapers were just filled with flying disc stories. And that summer, it was saucer mania. And it just kind of got embedded into the public's consciousness and never left.
And, this is so reminiscent. If you don't know your history, you're destined to repeat it. And it does seem as if this is so reminiscent of ATIP and OSAP and, how the Tic Tac is now in the media. And it seems that when you report seeing 9 objects glowing bright blue flying in a V formation of speeds, I think up to 1,700 miles an hour, Arnold said, there's some interest from the military, and it's strange that that's what it takes to get serious development of trained eyes on this and start historically, writing things down. It's just not taken seriously by the U.S. government, it seems, unless you have an instance like this one.
Yeah. I personally don't care whether the government takes it seriously or not. I hung out in fringe societies my whole life. I'm an old punk rocker, et cetera. So respectability has never been an issue with me.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the history, I think one of you still have MUFON, and you still have individual like people like Stan Gordon. You still have researchers who are collecting reports and keeping archives and maintaining a history. I think that's really important, but those groups are getting fewer and fewer. I mean, Stan Gordon's really getting up there, and a lot of the older investigators who actually keep these archives are getting up there. Hopefully there are young investigators still maintaining archives. I've found personally, like I've seen Martin also introduced me to David Marler. So David Marler has extensive archives in New Mexico. I lived in New Mexico for a year and a half recently for obvious reasons. I left Queens March 2020, so you can guess why. I was just there. I hung out with him for 3 hours. And like the Blue Book files, like, yeah, okay, you get a card, you get some newspaper clippings, but he's also got the Center for UFO Studies files and the NICAP files, National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, and a lot of files from other investigators who've donated to him for him to curate. And those files are so much more interesting. They're in-depth transcriptions of witness interviews. I've seen some like packed full of police reports and the newspaper clippings from the period. I mean, they're extensive and detailed. So I found the private investigators, in terms of documenting the history, have done a far better job than the government has.
I could not agree more. I think you're completely right about that. The government seems to hide these things away, and then they're lost to time, so to speak, in a lot of cases. And I think
they don't have a consistent protocol either. I mean, the recent hearing, Scott Bray was repeatedly saying we're destigmatizing reporting and coming up with a protocol to report. So if it's stigmatized and you have no protocol, how are you getting the reports?
Yeah, and I think David Marler is an excellent example. I loved his book, Triangular UFOs. I thought that was really well done.
Mm-hmm.
And now, in your opinion, this is something that I think a lot of people wonder about. What is the best way to archive this material? Because it's kind of a tough thing to do.
David Marler's doing. Actually, there are extensive archives. That's one thing I did in my book is part of the. I footnoted I footnoted it extensely and put a whole bunch of things under what I call the according to umbrella. So I very, very, very little speculation on my part, and I try to present just the facts. So I did extensive footnoting as close to the original sources as possible. But part of my part of the reason I did that is to give the reader a chance to go find this stuff for themselves. And there are archives all over the web. You've got the Archives for the Unexplained in Sweden, which has a huge physical archive, but they have a lot of good stuff online as well. And there's Northern Ontario UFO Research Society. I think that's one gentleman, I forget his name, but he's got a lot of really good old stuff, original magazine articles, and they're all over the place. There's archives.org. You can find Wendy Connor's UFO audio. She made an extensive collection of UFO-related audio recordings. You can find Woodrow Derenberger's first interview the day after he had his encounter with Indrid Cold on YouTube. It's all over the place. So, physical archives are an absolute pleasure. But the people who have the physical archives are more and more moving to make them digital and accessible from an armchair. To get back to your question, I'm sorry I took the long way around. Having a group or an individual, a group is better with a network that they can send to a centralized location, and to have people at that centralized location, put all the stuff in a filing cabinet. I think is the best way ultimately.
I think you're right. I think physical, not only is it more accurate and, drawings, etc. A lot of people have, quote unquote, lost information through digital means. And I find that's, I don't want to call it more risky, but it does seem like a lot of the things are not as highlighted as in physical, and physical has its own, obviously, fires, etc., floods, things can take it out, but that's a great answer. Yeah. And I love the Indrid Cold. I'm glad you mentioned that. That is one of my most, I think it's one of the most intriguing stories I've heard. And if for our listeners, could you kind of go into that a little bit? That's I find that a lot of people don't know about that, and it's one of the mighty ones.
Yeah, and it takes a weird turn too. What happened is Woodrow Derenberger, as an appliance salesman, he worked in the shop, but he also went on the road as a traveling salesman. So he was on his way back. He lived in Parkersburg, West Virginia. Mineral Wells, West Virginia, and he was on his way back home. And this car, what he thought was a car, passed him, and then it turned in front of him and traveled sideways and then slowed to a stop and forced him to stop. He pulled off to the side of the road. A door opened up. This humanoid got out. The craft lifted up. He described it as being shaped like the shade on a kerosene lantern. And this gentleman came out in black clothing and seemed to be wearing a shirt of shiny metallic kind of material underneath of it. Derenberger said he had a pleasant expression on his face, and he told Derenberger to roll down his window. And here's one of the weird parts. Derenberger said he then came over to the passenger side and spoke to him telepathically through the closed window. And he asked him, what do you do? Do you work for a living? And he asked what all the lights were in this one direction. And Derenberger replied that was Parkersburg. We call that a town. And Cold said, where I come from, we call that a gathering. So they had this telepathic conversation, and then Cold said, go tell people what you've seen. I'll come back and I'll back you up. I'll tell you that, I'll let people know that you're not making this up. And so the craft came down, Cold went in, craft takes off. Derenberger goes back to his house. His wife knows something's up. And then he tells her the story, and she says, well, you should call the police. So he calls the police. He wrote a book about this called Visitors to Lamulus, or I think Visitors from Lamulus. And he describes talking until he got too shaky to talk, and his wife took over. The police apparently told him that other people had reported this craft, and they didn't laugh it off. And the next day, he was working in the shop, people came to the shop And one guy was I think a producer or a reporter from a news program on the local news station, and said, would you be willing to be interviewed on air? And he was, and he told this story on air the very next day, and you can find it on YouTube. So if the story stopped right there, you'd be okay, yeah, sure. Unfortunately, he went on. Derenberger went on with his story, and the first people to hear the rest of the story were Gray Barker and John Keel. They were looking into the Mothman mystery, but along the way they said, well, we should. Barker had already interviewed Derenberger, and so they went over, and Derenberger said, okay, first the humanoid told Derenberger his name was Colt. That's all he said. And now Derenberger, in front of Barker and Keel, said he gave him a first name, Indrid, and that they visited and talked. And at the time, Derenberger's house his whole property was filled with people hoping to get a look at a spaceman or maybe get a shot at a spaceman. Some of them were carrying guns. And Derenberger started telling the story about them talking, and said they came from a planet called Lanulos, where the people were very little to no clothing because it got hot. And he went on to say, that they might come down and visit. And so the story went on that in Derenberger's book, he wrote that he had somebody, apparently a ghostwriter, I forget the guy's name, in the first edition of the book, as narrated by Woodrow Derenberger and written down by, I forget the guy's name. But in any case, in the book, he talks about going to the planet and that the space people drove around in Volkswagens, and that, the people on the planet weren't comfortable until he got nude, so he took off all his clothes and they were comfortable around him. So the story gets really, really strange. And Derenberger's life kind of fell apart after that. But I think there are other tales like that where you'll have like something that seems to have a kernel of truth to it, like something really happened, and then maybe something went wacky with the witness's mind and they just kept adding to this for attention or whatever. Or who knows, maybe Derenberger thought this stuff was really happening to him. So it's definitely a mystery. As silly as the story gets, it's really intriguing.
It really is, and I like the kind of writing, and I love John Keel, and this is a perfect kind of loop around back to what we were discussing originally, because John Keel also had a sort of rejection of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, like J. Allen Heineck and Jacques Vallée, and I think they were all initially not rejecting it, but certain things they found along the way, maybe stories of Volkswagens on different planets, etc., reinforce this. Is that erroneous to assume, or how do you think they drew that conclusion of the rejection of the extraterrestrial hypothesis in general?
I wouldn't say they entirely rejected it, but what made them different from a lot of the investigators is that they wouldn't ignore the stuff that didn't fit in with the narrative. So if you've got a narrative that these are nuts and bolts craft being piloted by extraterrestrials from other planets, and then you hear that when the witness got on the ship, they saw bunk beds that looked like they were made on Earth and a wooden radio. A lot of there would be some investigators, especially those who are writing books and trying to make money, who would leave that stuff out because it didn't fit the narrative and made the story seem screwy. Whereas Keel said this is a significant thing. If there's say if they think they actually saw that, you shouldn't discount it, and you should make that, part of the experience, part of the phenomenon, which, it may mean the phenomenon is extra especially weird, but, don't discount that. And Keel was also open to what he called the silent contactees. Contactees got a really bad name because of George Adamski and the circus that grew up around him and the other Georges, George Van Tassel and George King. So, people didn't want to touch contactee stories with a 10-foot pole, whereas Keel was open to them, especially ones that didn't seek publicity. And then Vallée and Heineck came around to this idea later. I don't think directly influenced by Keel, but they must have read some of Keel's writings on this. And so they Vallée tied it into fairy lore, and Heineck he was open to the idea that this was also from Keel, that this was some sort of consciousness that coexisted with us.
Yes, and I think I'm glad that you kind of set me straight on that, because the phenomenon, I believe they use different terms. They used ultra-terrestrial and interdimensional, and these were earth-shattering terms at the time, because up until that point, it was just little green men.
Yeah, I actually said on one podcast that that narrative is actually sort of comforting, and the host was aghast. And I said, well, the idea that this is something tangible, physical, something we could understand, creatures with a motive. Isn't that a lot more comfortable, that some sort of consciousness that coexists with us and likes to mess with us, that has no discernible goals?
So true, so true. And Keel also had some government background, I believe. So that's interesting. Going into the research and the formation of, there was Project Blue Book, there was also the Robertson panel, and it seemed like the Central Intelligence Agency was, and still is, very interested in this, and at least by outward appearance, hasn't figured it out yet.
I think the CIA's interest, and you've also got the FBI, those are other files. You can find extensive files on the Maury Island incident in FBI, what they call the Vault. I'm sure they kind of named that purposely close to John Greenwald Jr.'s site, theblackvault.com.
Mm-hmm.
But they put a whole bunch of UFO files online, the CIA and the FBI. And I think their interest, the FBI's interest, seems to have been more if a lot of investigators sort of present themselves as working for the FBI occasionally, and they would go investigate that. And the CIA, it seems more to do with national security, especially when people are leaking classified information. That seems to be the CIA's main interest. And there's also been speculation, Jack Brewer, that there were a lot of links between the CIA and NICAP, for instance. A lot of ex-CIA members were members of NICAP, starting with Hillencoder, Roscoe Hillencoder, who was the first director of the CIA. Mm-hmm. But there's speculation that, actually, no, I heard this from Ben Hansen. Ben Hansen says, well, if you want to test somebody's, see how well somebody can keep a secret, give them something like a UFO story, and make it specific. And if that UFO story shows up in the UFO literature, you know that you can't trust this guy. You've got a leak. Mm-hmm. And there was also the danger of adversaries infiltrating UFO groups to, if you're talking UFOs, you're talking about, what's being seen in the sky. So, and the possibility of leaked information about secret government projects. So, there's the fear that adversaries could get embedded in the UFO group and start getting leaked information and an idea of covert experimental testing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example, an explanation by Ben. He's a friend of mine, and I really like his the way that he goes about things, and he does have that government background as well. And it does seem like spooks have been infiltrating the UFO community for years, whether that be in the golden era or currently. Why does this devoted group of intelligence officials continue to follow the UFO community even when the government disavows it?
I think it's, we got to remember that any organization is made up of individuals. So I think, maybe some individuals actually, Richard Doty seems to have an actual interest in UFOs, and he likes going to conventions. He still does, apparently. So I think there's that. I think there was a bit of a paranormal arms race between us and Russia during the 80s and early 90s. Look out.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think there may be some of the disinformation that came down the pipe, because ufology really went off the rails in the 80s and 90s. There were all kinds of wild stories going around, and especially like the Bob Lazar story. No matter what you think of that, maybe being kind to Lazar, maybe he was actually shown stuff and convinced that this was actually alien tech, so that he would spread the story, and that the Russians would and others would think that we had alien tech.
Yeah, it's true, and I'm glad that your book focuses on the golden era, or kind of like this age of it was like a utopia back then. It seemed like the investigators were more worried about getting to the bottom of what was going on than likes or clicks or ratings or the things that seem to muddy the water these days. And John Keel, if I'm not mistaken, also brought the term Men in Black sort of to the mainstream. And it seems like these Men in Black have also kind of become part of the UFO phenomenon, and is almost kind of, they're stigmatized, but they're also just kind of mixed in with the soup. In your research, did you find a lot of cases where Men in Black were involved, or where investigators were writing these things down?
There was a weird series of memos that came out of the Air Force to look out for people who were impersonating Air Force officers. There was one particular case where UFO witnesses were rounded up and told to be quiet, and the Air Force, and they said they were from the Air Force, and the Air Force had no knowledge of this. I think there was an article in the UFO Investigator where specifically it was mentioned that a CIA officer had intimidated a witness who was going to appear on a television program or a radio program. So there were those instances. Of course, they play prominently in Keel's book, The Mothman Prophecies. And Keel seemed to think they were more ethereal, or more, that they came from the ultra-terrestrials. But yeah, the definite instances I saw were specifically mentioned in the Air Force memo.
Yeah, and that's informative, because it seems that a lot of people have, it's pretty much Roswell is sort of where they kick the football off. And everybody seemed to be referencing flying saucers after that point, extraterrestrial contact encounters, more sightings.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that didn't really get going until the 70s. Roswell was a non-issue during the before that. It came and went. Mm-hmm. It was, it was considered to be a weather balloon. And the investigators, it happened in July 47. and the private investigators didn't really get going until the 50s.
That makes sense.
So, yeah. So it was a non-issue to them at the time, which is why I don't talk about it at all in the book, because it didn't exist to them. Stanton Friedman resurrected that in the 70s.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like, at least in popular culture, that's kind of when things, and it seems like a lot of these government organizations sort of started up right around that same time period. Let's get to one that is more in the kind of in the middle of the playing field, which is the Betty and Barney Hill abduction story and their account. Do you think, how much truth is there to that? I mean, there's a lot of ins and outs, the pregnancy test. What was your opinion of that endeavor?
It's hard not to take Betty Hill at her word, and Barney. He didn't last too long. He died very shortly after the incident. But there were weird symptoms. He had warts around his genitals. His tops of his shoes were scraped after he been reported being dragged. There was a lot of supporting stuff around that. They kept a lid on that story for years. It didn't come out until, I forget the author's name, but I think he wrote about it, a reporter wrote about it in the Boston Traveler. I think he somehow got a hold of some of their transcripts from their hypnosis sessions and wrote up an article in the Boston Traveler, and without the Hills' permission, and without them wanting it to. It went big time. It went international. That story, it definitely is one of those where I believe in my opinion, I believe they experienced something, and were telling the truth about what they experienced.
Yeah, it's a freaky case. It is not all nonsense. And in your opinion, a lot of folks now, it seems like with a lot of researchers, this happens. After their death, they are kind of memorialized and turned into martyrs. And I see that with Heineck a lot. Do you think he realized that he was going to have this lifelong, endeavor of becoming the UFO guy and then taking Jacques Vallée under his wing? I mean, they were quite the dynamic duo. Do you think he knew? Yeah.
I mean, it was a good paycheck for a long time. He was getting paid as a consultant by the Air Force for the entirety of their investigation, from like 48 until 69. And in the beginning, he was doing his duty as an astronomer and as a scientist. And, he was kind of a villain for most, up until all the way up until the infamous swamp gas episode in 1966 in Michigan. What's funny is he actually at the conference, at the news conference where you can see on YouTube, he says marsh gas. I don't hear him say swamp gas at all. I don't know if he said it off camera or if there's missing footage, but he said marsh gas, but it became swamp gas. He explained away some sightings as he mentioned a couple of possibilities, and included the idea that since a lot of these sightings in Michigan were around the swamp, that you had gas from the swamp would ignite in one area and then go out, and then ignite in another area and then go out, and it would give the appearance of movement. And he was vilified for that. And he shows up in the major publications for the two biggest groups, NICAP and APRO at the time, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, run by Jim and Cora Lorenzen. They put out the APRO Bulletin, and NICAP put out the UFO Investigator. And Heineck is, just shows up as a bit of a villain throughout their publications until after the 60s, especially when James McDonald took him to task for a lot of... McDonald got a look at a lot of the Blue Book files and saw Heineck writing off what he thought were just good sightings with ridiculous explanations, and Heineck would sign off on them.
Mm-hmm.
And McDonald really hammered him for that. And especially after the Condon report came out, Heineck stood up and said, that this should be looked at scientifically. It seems the Socorro case really turned Heineck around, was one of a few. So, yeah, the idea that he would go... towards the end of his life, I actually just read... there's a recent biography of him, the UFO Man, I just read it too. Anyway, there's a recent biography of him, and towards the end of his life, a millionaire actually said, he would give him funding to start a UFO center in Arizona, I think right outside of Phoenix. And he moved from, he was in Illinois at the time. So he moved from Illinois down to Arizona and was going to set up shop down there and just, devote the rest of his life to UFO research. And that kind of fell through, and he died shortly thereafter. But, I guess he sort of accepted his fate, but he actually did a lot in astronomy. I think he developed photographic techniques for satellites. He did a lot for astronomy, and that's all forgotten. It just seems that if you get into this, you end up becoming known for ufology, and all the other stuff you do seems to get forgotten. For instance, James McDonald was a brilliant atmospheric physicist, and everybody knows him as a UFO guy. So.
Yeah, and it does seem like if the longer you're in this, the more that you're vilified for whatever reason. If you're in the game long enough, you become the villain, and some people have that belief of some researchers. I'm glad you mentioned the Lonnie Zamora incident, the Socorro incident, because that kind of leads into these a lot of New Mexican desert cases, high desert cases, and grizzly cattle mutilations. Where do they come into the UFO subject matter, in your opinion?
That's a slippery slope. The people have done much more. I haven't done anything in terms of that. I'm an historical researcher, and that's where I like to stay. So I'm according to, it keeps me safe. I'm an agnostic, and there are days I believe everything. There are days I believe nothing. Actually, a quote from Gray Barker, and he was actually quoted as saying, "I believe in that. What do you believe, Gray?" And he says, "I believe in everything and nothing." And I kind of go along with that. Looking at it as folklore, I think, is really interesting. But anyway, back to cattle mutilations, as I'm trying to avoid the subject. Gabe Valdez was a policeman up in Dulce, New Mexico. Did a lot of investigation into cattle mutilation because it was, in his backyard, and he seemed to come to the conclusion that it was humans. And an interesting thing about Dulce is there was this whole thing, Atoms for Peace movement, where they were trying to come up with peaceful uses of atomic bombs, essentially. The idea of blowing up nuclear weapons to divert hurricanes. I think our former president actually floated that idea, which is not feasible. But another thing they did up around Dulce was it was called Project Gas Buggy. So essentially, it was atomic fracking. They buried an atomic weapon and blew it up. And unfortunately, the gas they were hoping to release was all irradiated and therefore useless. So you've got a source of radiation right up there in Dulce, and then all of a sudden you've got cattle mutilations. So there's speculation that part of that was government testing to see, if our food stock has been poisoned by radiation. And plus, that whole area, all the nuclear testing in Nevada is not too far from the whole area where, the winds went all over Colorado and all over that area. So the idea that they're testing for, contamination is not that far-fetched. But then if you go with the idea that the phenomena is reflective, I think other people have this, who specialize in cattle mutilation. So that's as far as I go with cattle mutilation.
I hear you. It's a very slippery slope, and Gabe Valdez added a very interesting trump card to the mix with his research. Another case that I wanted to ask your opinion about is one of my favorite cases. And in 1952, there was a Flatwoods monster that seemed to terrify, 6 kids, a mom, a dog, and pretty much the whole world. What are your thoughts of that case? Yeah,
well, okay, let me tell you about my journey first. I actually stayed in Magdalena, New Mexico. Magdalena is where Lonnie Zamora was. I think he was born and raised. I actually spoke to people that knew Lonnie Zamora. He's the guy who got the policeman who saw the craft during the Socorro incident. One of the great quotes somebody told me at a party was Lonnie was interviewed and said, the interviewer asked him, "Sir, were you in a state of confusion?" He says, "No, sir, I was in the state of New Mexico." But anyway, on my way back to Queens, I drove back. So I stopped at Roswell, and then my next stop was West Virginia. So I stopped in in Sutton County, West Virginia, which is around the Flatwoods, and I stopped at the Flatwoods Monster Museum. It's got some original newspaper clippings, I think original artwork done of the monster. I spoke with the gentleman who runs the Flatwoods Monsters Museum. So I'm a big fan of that case. And then afterwards, I stopped I stopped at Point Pleasant, went to the Mothman Museum, and I stopped at the Clarksburg Harrison Public Library and got to peruse the Gray Barker collection and talk with David Houchin, who was a curator there. So it was an amazing journey back to Queens. But the Flatwoods monster case has always fascinated me. It's such a weird one. And a lot of people think there's speculation it was an owl, but they saw it underneath a branch, and normally you would see an owl sitting on top of a branch. They used the branch to estimate its height, I think at 12 feet. And a thing that gets left out, everybody talks about the monster, but what gets left out is that they also saw, I think it was a big half dome glowing the size of a house that this creature or robot or whatever it was made an arc towards after it released gas and hissed at them, and they ran screaming. But this thing made an arc towards what could have been some sort of craft, according to the witnesses. So it's a really interesting case, and Gray Barker did a really good investigation of it, interviewed all the witnesses and got their stories. And Ivan T. Sanderson also investigated the case. His speculation that there were a whole bunch of fireballs seen, I think traveling northeast to southwest across a lot of states. And his speculation, I think he counted 6, and his speculation on the Long John Nebel show was that one of these crafts, the air was so polluted over West Virginia that one of the crafts got into trouble and had to crash land, and that was the one with the monster in it. So, but it's a really cool case. I mean, and the monster is absolutely iconic.
It really is. It's one of those cases that, I mean, there's just no rhyme or reason to, and it doesn't fit in any of the boxes. And, you know, it's just wild. It's just wild that everybody was so horrified by this Frankenstein-looking robotic extraterrestrial, more or less. And I had never heard that suspenseful, that the air, I was kind of in suspense about that the air was actually polluted. I had never heard that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, West Virginia's coal country, so.
Oh, that could explain it.
I think that was what Sanderson was talking about. I want to mention Seth Breedlove, documentarian, he did a documentary, it was probably a couple of years ago, did a documentary on the Flatwoods case, and he actually interviewed 2 of the witnesses who were just kids, Ed and Fred May. So you can see like a modern interview of these 2 guys talking about the case. I highly recommend that documentary just for that. The fact that you got 2 of the original witnesses still alive today talking about the case. And, you know, they stick to their story. One thing they do say, though, is that the reports of everybody getting sick were false. Which is interesting because that seems to be a key element of the case where, you know, they reported that the witnesses were vomiting and that the dog died. There's actually 3 versions of what happened to the dog. One, he crawled under a porch, one, he vomited on the porch, and one, he died on the porch. So, but yeah, according to the Mays, that part was false.
Interesting. I never knew that. As we sort of wrap up here, where can listeners delve into your accumulation of all this research, the Flying Saucer Investigators, your book? How do you recommend they get their hands on this book and support your research efforts?
Amazon.com. It's available in Kindle, audiobook, hardcover, softcover. I think flyingdiscpress.com. You can get a copy there as well. And I will write a weekly blog for Martin, a written version at podcastufo.com. And I do an audio version. Martin posts on his YouTube site. Martin Willis Podcast UFO will probably get you there.
That is great. And as we wrap up, Charles, I can't thank you enough for being so patient with me. I had some family emergencies and technical drenchings and other things.
Oh, it's all good. No, it's been a great conversation, Ryan.
And I know you got a flat tire today, so I really appreciate your diligence, your research, and your ability to just kind of work with me and get this done. I appreciate it.
No problem.
Thanks so much, and I hope we can talk again.
Absolutely. All right, Brian. You have a great night.
Take care. You too.
Cheers.
Okay, we are off, and I will, as soon as this is up, I'll send you a link, and I don't know what you prefer. I can send you a YouTube link, an Anchor audio-only link, or I can send it in a few other formats. What do you usually like?
YouTube will be fine. Whatever's easiest for you.
That's what I'll do, Charles. Thanks so much, my man. I hope you have a great afternoon.
You too, Ryan. Cheers.
Take care. Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Charles Lear, someone who has done the work, done the research, and he's really connected a lot of dots between UFOs, their study, their traits, and, the history of it. After Blue Book got started, this established a whole different time for the United States and how UFOs were viewed in popular culture and the media. And it's great that people have the capacity to go back as historical researchers, and they continue to bring things to light that really just haven't been. For example, I didn't know that Heineck never said swamp gas, for example. I didn't know that the Flatwood monster case, people didn't get as sick as they claimed. There's a lot that Charles knows that the average person doesn't know, and I'm really glad that he worked with me. It was a real trial and error time connecting. I was up in Utah's Uinta Basin doing some research at spacewolfresearch.com, and the mishaps with technology were beyond my control. And poor Charles, even today, had a flat tire on his way to do this podcast interview, and he had to rent a city bike to get to the interview on time. Anyway, long story short, the entire time along the way, we kept communication lines open. He did everything he could to make this happen, and I think you guys should make it happen, that you get this book of his on your shelves, read it, enjoy it, and continue to support his research. Until next time, keep your eyes to the skies, feet on the ground, but don't forget to take a look around.
Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine.